The hiss of the espresso machine was a welcome interruption, a sharp tear in the fabric of the ugly sound he was making. Brielle kept her eyes fixed on the swirl of cream in her cooling coffee, refusing to look at him. If she looked at Sang, she would either break or she would fight, and she was not in the mood for either. Not tonight. Not again. He was speaking in Korean, a rapid-fire cadence of clipped, angry syllables she could not understand. He always did this in public. It was a power play, a way to dress her down in a language that isolated her, turning her into a silent, unknowing prop in her own humiliation. The words were foreign, but the tone was universal. It was the same venom he used in English, just wrapped in a different code. The pressure in the small cafe felt immense, as if the very air was thickening with his displeasure. Brielle was a nursing student. She understood pressure. She knew how to move with purpose when a patient was coding, how to find a vein on a dehydrated arm, how to speak in calm, measured tones when a family was falling apart. That was a world of controlled chaos, of life and death decisions made in seconds. This, however, was different. This was a slow, suffocating poison. This was weakness. Her weakness. The man at the next table had not moved in 20 minutes. When she and Sang had first sat down, she'd registered him in that peripheral way one registers their surroundings, a dark suit, impossibly well-tailored, and a profound stillness. He sat alone, a cup of black coffee untouched before him. He was looking out the window at the rain-slicked Los Angeles street, but his focus felt internal, absolute. The only thing she'd noticed with any clarity were his hands. They rested on the table, one loosely curled, the other flat. They were elegant hands, clean and sculpted, but there was a tension in them, a coiled potential that seemed at odds with his relaxed posture. Sang's voice rose, and a few patrons glanced over. He slammed his palm on the table, not hard enough to be a scene, but hard enough to make the silverware jump. Hard enough for her. Brielle's chin lifted, her gaze finally meeting his. His eyes were bright with a familiar, ugly rage. He was still speaking Korean, but now his words were slower, more deliberate. He leaned forward, the cloying scent of his cologne washing over her. Then he reached across the table and his fingers wrapped around her wrist. The grip was tight. A statement. An ownership. Her breath hitched. It was the suddenness of it, the casual claim in a public space. Her pulse throbbed against his thumb. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him to let go, to say something, anything. Let her go. The voice was quiet, deeper than she'd expected. It came from the next table. Sang's head snapped around. Brielle's eyes followed, landing on the man in the dark suit. He had not turned his body, only his head. His face was all sharp angles and shadows in the cafe's dim lighting. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and fixed on Sang's hand clamped around her wrist. He spoke in perfect, unaccented English. The words were a simple request, but they landed in the space between them like stones. Sang scoffed, a wet, dismissive sound. He tightened his grip on Brielle, pulling her slightly forward. He answered in Korean, his tone mocking and aggressive. A challenge. The man in the suit did not react. His expression remained unchanged, but something in his stillness shifted. It became heavier, more deliberate. I will not ask again, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Brielle watched, frozen, as a flicker of uncertainty crossed Sang's face. He was trying to size the man up, trying to place him in the hierarchy of the world, he understood. The suit was expensive, Tom Ford by the cut of it. The watch on his wrist was a discreet Patek Philippe, its face dark and unadorned. These were signs of wealth, but not necessarily power. Sang, emboldened by his own arrogance, made his decision. He spat another stream of Korean, gesturing dismissively at the man. Then he stood up, yanking on Brielle's arm to pull her to her feet. We are leaving, he snarled at her in English. Her wrist ached. The humiliation burned hot in her chest. But before she could find her footing, the man in the suit moved. It was not a fast movement, but it was surgical. He rose from his chair, a fluid unfolding of long limbs, and placed himself directly in Sang's path. He was taller than Sang, broader in the shoulders than the suit had let on.
"You're not," the man said.
The finality in his voice was absolute. Two other men, previously invisible in the cafe's clientele, now stood from their own tables. They materialized like ghosts, their presence instantly changing the temperature of the room. They flanked the exit, their expressions blank, their hands loose at their sides. The air grew thin, charged with a voltage that had nothing to do with Sang's petty anger. It was something older, colder. Sang finally saw it. He finally understood. His face went pale, a sickly, waxy color under the fluorescent lights. His eyes widened, not with anger, but with a primal, gut-wrenching terror. He looked at the man in the suit, and a name seemed to form on his lips, unspoken and choked. His hand fell away from Brielle's wrist, as if it had been burned. The man, the boss she now realized he must be, did not even look at Sang. His dark eyes found Brielle's. There was no warmth in them, no sympathy. It was the detached assessment of a predator calculating the variables of a hunt. He said, the man began, his voice a low, intimate murmur meant only for her, that if you ever tried to leave him, he would find your family. He described, in detail, what he would do to your mother first. Brielle's blood ran cold. The incomprehensible sounds Sang had been making suddenly coalesced into sharp, ugly images. Her stomach twisted. She felt a wave of nausea, so profound she swayed on her feet. The man's gaze held hers. He saw it all. He had understood every single word. "He is no longer your concern," the man said. It was not a reassurance. It was a statement of fact. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod to one of his men. Sang was escorted out of the cafe, silent and trembling, his earlier bravado dissolving into the terrified obedience of a dog that has been shown the whip. The silence he left behind was vast and terrifying. The other patrons were staring, but it felt like they were miles away. The only thing that felt real was the man standing in front of her. His cologne reached her then, a subtle, clean scent of cedar and something else, something like cold night air. "You will come with me now," he said. It was not a question.
It was not a request.
It was an instruction. And Brielle, looking from the empty doorway where Sang had disappeared to the unblinking certainty in this man's eyes, knew that she had just traded one cage for another. She did not know his name. She did not know who he was. But she knew, with an instinct that chilled her to the bone, that saying no was not an option. That was the moment her world, the one with nursing exams and late-night study sessions, fractured and fell away, leaving her standing on the edge of his. The car was a black Maybach, so silent it felt like a vacuum-sealed chamber moving through the city. Brielle sat stiffly against the plush leather, her hands clenched in her lap. She stared out the window at the blurred neon lights of Koreatown, refusing to look at him. He sat opposite her, not beside her. The space between them a tangible thing, a chasm of unspoken threat. He had not spoken a word since they left the cafe. His name, she learned from a brief, deferential exchange with the driver, was Min. Just Min. It was a name that felt too simple for the weight of his presence. They arrived at a sleek, glass-and-steel high-rise that pierced the downtown skyline. The private elevator ascended with a stomach-lurching speed, opening directly into a penthouse that was less a home and more a monument to cold, minimalist wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a panoramic, glittering vista of Los Angeles. The furniture was sparse, expensive, and brutally uncomfortable looking. There was no art on the walls, no photographs, no sign that a human being actually lived here. It was a beautiful, sterile cage. "Sang is the son of Lee Jae-wook," Min said, his voice cutting through the silence. He was standing by the window, his back to her, a dark silhouette against the city lights. "His father is a problem I am currently solving." Brielle finally found her voice. "What does that have to do with me?" "By threatening you so loudly in a public place, Sang made himself visible. By extension, he made you visible." Min turned from the window. "You are now a loose thread, a witness to his recklessness. And my enemies know that I do not tolerate loose threads. So what are you going to do? Kill me?" The words came out sharper than she intended, fueled by a fear that was beginning to curdle into anger. A flicker of something, not quite amusement, but a distant cousin of it, passed through his eyes. Killing you would be inefficient. It would create more problems than it would solve. He walked toward the bar, pouring 2 glasses of water. He set one on the marble coffee table in front of her. For now, you will stay here, where I can see you, where my rivals cannot. I'm not your prisoner. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. Are you not? He asked, his voice soft. He gestured toward the elevator. The doors will not open for you. The building's security answers to me. You are exactly my prisoner, Brielle. He said her name. He must have gotten it from her ID in her wallet, which she now realized was missing from her purse. The way he said it was different. It was not the casual, shortened Brie her friends used, or the annoyed tone Sang had favored. He pronounced every syllable with a quiet precision, as if testing its weight on his tongue. It was unsettling. Days bled into one another. She existed in the suspended animation of the penthouse. Min was a ghost, often gone for hours, sometimes days. When he was there, he moved with a silent economy, occupying the space without ever truly filling it. He worked in a closed-off office, took hushed calls on the balcony, and ate his meals in silence. Brielle spent her time reading the books from his sterile library, watching the city breathe below, and fighting the creeping sense of despair. She was confident. She was a survivor. She refused to be a damsel in his gilded tower. She tested the limits of her confinement, noting the patterns of the guards in the hall, the timing of food deliveries. She was gathering intelligence, just as he would. One evening, the penthouse alarm system shrieked to life, a deafening, piercing sound. Red lights flashed, and heavy metal shutters slammed down over the windows, plunging the apartment into a blood-red twilight. Min appeared from his office in an instant.
He was not panicked.
He moved with a lethal calm that was more terrifying than any alarm. Down, he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. He was already moving toward her. He did not grab her or shove her. Instead, he simply placed a hand on the back of her neck and guided her down behind the massive marble island in the kitchen. His body shielded hers, his presence a wall of dark wool and muscle between her and the unseen threat. The scent of cedar and cold air was overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the steady, slow rhythm of his breathing. The alarm stopped as suddenly as it had started. A voice came over an intercom, speaking to Min in clipped, professional tones. A perimeter breach. Neutralized. A message sent. Min did not move for a long moment. His hand was still on her neck, his thumb stroking a slow, almost unconscious pattern against her skin. It was the first gentle touch she had felt in what felt like a lifetime. It was small, almost deniable, but it was there. He finally pulled back, the absence of his touch leaving the spot on her neck feeling cold. His eyes scanned her, a quick, clinical assessment. Are you harmed? No, her voice was hoarse. His gaze dropped to her wrist, where the faint, yellowing shadow of Sang's grip was still visible. His expression tightened, the muscles in his jaw clenching. Weakness invites predators, he said, his voice low and rough. It is a lesson you learn once, or you do not survive to learn it again. It was not an apology, or even an explanation. It felt like a memory surfacing, something painful he was saying more to himself than to her. It was the first crack she had seen in his marble facade, a glimpse of the man beneath the monster. A wound. He had failed to protect someone once before. He would not fail again. Later that night, long after the shutters had retracted and the city was once again on display, she found him on the balcony. He was staring down at the river of headlights, a glass of whiskey in his hand. She could have stayed inside. She could have left him to his ghosts. But she found herself walking out into the cool night air, wrapping her arms around herself. She stood beside him, not speaking, just sharing the silence. It was a choice. A deliberate choice to stay, when every instinct screamed to run. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was something else, something she did not have a name for yet. He glanced at her, his eyes catching the light from the city. For the first time, she saw something other than calculation in them. It was a flicker of surprise, a hint of something that might have been respect. That was the moment the charged silence between them became something more than just the absence of words. It became a language of its own. The rehook, the moment the floor truly dropped out from under her, came a week later. Unable to sleep, Brielle found herself drawn to the door of his office, which he had left slightly ajar. A sliver of light cut across the dark hallway. Against her better judgment, she pushed it open. The office was as Spartan as the rest of the penthouse, dominated by a massive desk and a wall of monitors displaying security feeds. But on the opposite wall was a large corkboard, covered in a web of photographs, documents, and handwritten notes connected by colored string. It was a map of a war. And in the center, circled in red, was a picture of Sang. Surrounding him were photos of an older, stern-faced man, his father, Lee Jae-wook, and dozens of other men. This was not a random act of protection. Min had been hunting Sang's family long before she ever sat down in that cafe. She had not stumbled into his world by accident. She had been the catalyst, the spark in a room full of gasoline. The realization that her life had been a pawn in a much larger game should have terrified her. Instead, a cold, hard anger settled in her bones. She was not a piece to be moved. She was a player. That decision was tested 2 days later. Min had to move, a mandatory appearance at a high-level meeting. He took her with him. "You are more vulnerable here alone," was his only explanation. The trip in the Maybach was tense, a silent journey through the concrete canyons of the city. Brielle watched the streets, her senses on high alert. The attack came without warning. A black SUV slammed into their side, sending the Maybach screeching across the rain-slicked pavement and into a concrete barrier. The world became a storm of shattering glass and groaning metal. Before Brielle could even process the impact, Min was moving. He threw himself over her, his body a shield, his arm clamped around her head to protect it from the imploding window. Gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of automatic weapons peppering their car. Min's driver was already returning fire, the interior of the car filling with the acrid smell of cordite. "Stay down." Min's voice was a harsh growl in her ear, his breath hot against her skin. He pushed her down onto the floorboards, then rose into a crouch, his own weapon appearing in his hand as if from thin air. He moved with the brutal choreography of a man born to violence. It was precise, economical, and utterly lethal. She watched, mesmerized and horrified, as he took aim and fired through the shattered rear window. A scream from outside, then silence from that direction. Another of Min's men, riding in a follow car, was down on the pavement. The war was no longer on a corkboard. It was here, bloody and real.
They were pinned down.
Min grunted, a sharp intake of breath. He slumped back against the seat, and Brielle saw the dark stains spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt, high on his shoulder. "You're hit," she whispered, her nursing instincts kicking in, overriding the fear. "It is a scratch," he bit out, reloading his weapon with a steady hand. But she saw the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the slight tremor he could not quite control. It was not a scratch. They made it out. Min's remaining men were brutally efficient, and the attackers, having lost the element of surprise, retreated. They abandoned the ruined Maybach and switched to a nondescript sedan, speeding away into the labyrinth of the city. They did not go back to the penthouse. They went to a rundown apartment in a forgotten neighborhood, a safe house that smelled of dust and decay. Inside, Min finally sagged against a wall, his face pale. The wound in his shoulder was a deep, ragged tear, bleeding sluggishly. "My medic is 40 minutes out," his man reported, his voice tight with worry. "He'll bleed out by then," Brielle said, her voice clear and steady. She looked at Min. "There's a risk of arterial damage. I need to stop the bleeding now." Min's eyes, clouded with pain, focused on her. He gave a short, sharp nod. There was no medical kit, only a threadbare first aid box with gauze, antiseptic, and a few other useless items. She found a sewing kit in a drawer and a bottle of cheap whiskey in a cabinet. It would have to do. I need you to take off your shirt. And I need a knife and a lighter. She worked with a focus that pushed everything else away. She cleaned the wound, her touch firm and professional. She saw the damaged vessel, small but persistent. Gauze would not stop it. Pressure would not stop it. She looked at the knife his man had given her. She looked at Min. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice betraying nothing of the turmoil inside her. This was the line, the one she could not uncross. She heated the tip of the knife in the flame of the lighter until it glowed a dull red. His man looked away. Min just watched her, his dark eyes intense, trusting. She pressed the searing metal to the bleeder. He hissed, his entire body going rigid, a strangled sound of agony torn from his throat, but he did not cry out. The smell of burned flesh filled the small room. She had crossed it. She was no longer just a nursing student.
She was a part of this.
After she'd stitched the rest of the gash with shaking but steady hands, using whiskey to sterilize the needle and thread, she sat back on her heels, exhausted. He was slumped against the wall, conscious but drained. He watched her for a long time, the silence stretching between them. "You have a capacity for survival," he said finally, his voice rough, "that I did not anticipate." Brielle met his gaze, the anger she'd felt in his office returning, cold and pure. "I'm not leaving until this is done," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Sang put his hands on me. His family tried to kill us. They don't get to walk away." It was not a declaration of love. It was a declaration of war, a confession of a different kind, a bond forged not in affection, but in shared blood and violence. It was more dangerous and more honest than any romantic promise. The next day, the enemy made their move. It was not against Min. It was against her. Her face, a grainy security camera still from the cafe, was plastered across the dark web forums and underworld message boards. There was a bounty on her head, a price for the woman who belonged to Kwon Min-jun. They had given him a name, and they had made her a target. She was no longer a loose thread. She was the prize. The bounty changed everything. It made Brielle a liability of the highest order. Every shadow could hold an opportunist, every stranger a potential threat. Min's men formed a tight, suffocating bubble of security around her, but the safe house felt more like a prison than ever. The weight of the price on her head was a physical thing, a constant pressure at the base of her skull. Min was recovering, his movement stiff, but his will unbroken. The violence of the attack had stripped away the last vestiges of his corporate facade, leaving behind the raw, predatory essence of the man he was. He watched her constantly, his gaze heavy with a new, unsettling intensity. It was not just the calculating assessment of an asset. It was possessive, protective. "This ends now," he said one evening, his voice flat and cold as he stared at a tablet displaying her face next to a string of zeros. "Lee Jae-wook used his son's mistake to make you a target. We will use his son to burn his empire to the ground." His plan was direct, a surgical strike aimed at Sang. But Brielle knew it was flawed. "He'll be expecting you to come for him," she said, interrupting his briefing with his top lieutenant. "Sang is arrogant, but his father isn't stupid. It's a trap." Min's lieutenant looked at her with disdain, but Min simply turned his head, his dark eyes pinning her. "What do you propose?" This was her moment. She would not be the bait in his trap. She would be the hunter. "Sang thinks I'm a terrified civilian, a weakness he can exploit."
He's right.
"I am terrified. But he's wrong about me being weak." She took a deep breath. "He won't expect me to come for him. On my own terms." Her plan was audacious. Lure Sang not to a dark alley or an abandoned warehouse, but to a public, crowded space. The atrium of the Getty Center. A place of glass and light and art, filled with tourists and security cameras. A place where a gunfight would be a catastrophic loss of face for his father, a man who built his reputation on discretion. She would be the bait, but she would control the board. Min's immediate answer was a single, sharp word.
"No."
"You think you're protecting me by keeping me locked away," she argued, stepping closer to him, her voice low and urgent. But all you're doing is waiting for them to find a crack in your walls. This way, we choose the time. We choose the place. He won't be able to resist the chance to get me back, to prove to his father he can clean up his own mess. She saw the war in his eyes. The tactician in him recognized the strategic value of her plan. The man, the one who carried the wound of a past failure, recoiled from the idea of putting her in harm's way. "You are not a weapon," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're wrong," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "After what I did for you in that apartment, after what they've done to me, I'm the only weapon you have that they won't see coming." He finally relented, the cost of his agreement etched in the hard lines of his face. The day of the meet was unnaturally bright. Brielle felt a strange, cold calm as she walked through the museum's sun-drenched atrium. She wore a simple dress, an earpiece hidden by her hair, her only concession to the danger. Min's men were ghosts among the tourists, invisible but present. Min himself was watching from a security hub, a voice in her ear. She sat on a bench as planned, a book open in her lap, her heart hammering a steady, controlled rhythm against her ribs. Then she saw him. Sang was walking toward her, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He had 2 men with him, but there were more, she knew, melting into the crowd. More than they'd anticipated. The plan was already going sideways. "I knew you'd miss me," Sang said, his voice dripping with condescending poison as he sat beside her. "There's a sniper on the roof of the building opposite," Brielle said, not looking at him, her voice a calm whisper. "My man, not yours. If your people make a move, you'll be the first to die. I wanted to look you in the eye when I told you that." His smile faltered. He followed her gaze and saw the glint of light on a distant lens. "Why?" he hissed. "You made a mistake, Sang," she said, finally turning to face him. "You threatened my family, and you underestimated me." She leaned in closer. "But your biggest mistake was trusting your father. Did he ever tell you what happened to his partner, Mr. Choi? The man he built his entire organization with? The man whose daughter he was supposed to protect?" She saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes. She was feeding him a piece of intelligence she gleaned from the corkboard, a detail about a long-forgotten betrayal. She spun the story, weaving a lie around a kernel of truth, painting a picture of his father as a man who sacrificed everyone for his own ambition. A man who would sacrifice his own son. It was a gamble, a desperate play to shatter his loyalty. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it failed. He sneered, raising a hand to signal his men. But then he hesitated. A seed of doubt. That was all she needed. In that instant of hesitation, Min's voice crackled in her ear.
"Now."
The tourists began to scream as Min's men moved in, a silent, coordinated swarm. It was not a firefight. It was a dismantling. Sang's men were neutralized with brutal, non-lethal efficiency. In the chaos, Sang grabbed Brielle, pulling her up as a shield, a knife appearing at her throat. But Brielle was ready. She drove her elbow back into his ribs, hard, and as he grunted in pain, she stomped her heel down on his instep. He roared, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She twisted free, shoving him away from her and directly into the path of Min's lieutenant. It was over in seconds. In the aftermath, as museum security swarmed and sirens wailed in the distance, Min appeared at her side. His men had already vanished with Sang. He stood before her, his suit immaculate, his face an unreadable mask. But his eyes, when they met hers, held a raw, undeniable truth. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet amidst the chaos. "You are not a liability. You are a weapon for a man like him." It was the most profound declaration he could make. It was an acknowledgement, a claim. The cost of that victory was a loyal soldier, a young man on Min's team who was gravely injured in the takedown. He would live, but he would never work again. A reminder that in this world, nothing was without price. They were back in the penthouse. The city lights glittered below like a carpet of fallen stars. The silence was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with everything that had happened between them. Min stood by the window, his back to her, a dark, solitary figure. "It is over," he said, his voice flat. "Lee's organization is broken. Sang will be used to ensure it never rises again.
You are safe now.
You can go." He was giving her an out. A return to her old life of textbooks and clinical rotations. A life where her greatest danger was a failing grade, not a bounty on her head. Brielle walked toward him until she was standing just behind him. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of cedar that clung to him. She looked at their two reflections in the vast expanse of glass, two figures suspended between the sky and the glittering, dangerous city below. She did not answer him right away. Instead, she raised her hand and placed her palm flat against the cool glass next to the reflection of his face. "You and I both know that's not true," she said, her voice soft but certain. She was no longer the girl from the cafe. She was the woman who had stared down a killer, who had cauterized a wound with a hot knife, who had chosen her own battleground. "I'm not running anymore." He did not turn, but in the reflection, she saw his eyes close for a single, brief moment. It was not an ending, and it was not a beginning.
It was a choice.
A truth acknowledged in the heart of the empire he commanded, an empire she had just claimed a piece of for herself.